Mark Sutton was the kind of guy who didn't just chase his dreams, he flew after them. Born into a family of serious prestige, his dad was Air Marshal Sir John Matthias Dobson Sutton, a Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath and a former Lieutenant Governor of the island of Jersey. With a pedigree like that, Mark was expected to follow the straight and narrow path of military honor. And for a while, he did. In 1991, he joined the Army and served with distinction for 4 years, ticking all the right boxes. But here's the thing, the predictable life of military service didn't quite cut it for Mark. After leaving the Army in 1995, he took a sharp turn into London's high-stakes financial sector. Sounds glamorous, right? Well, not so much for a guy with adventure in his blood. Suits and boardrooms couldn't compare to the thrill he was really craving. So while he balanced the demands of finance, he found his true passion elsewhere. In the clouds. Enter wingsuit flying, the ultimate extreme sport. Imagine diving off cliffs and gliding through the air at breakneck speeds, with nothing but a specially designed suit keeping you from free falling. For Mark, this wasn't just a hobby, it was pure exhilaration, and he wasn't just good at it, he was exceptional. In no time, his skills earned him international fame, and in 2012, he got his biggest spotlight moment, performing a skydiving stunt as James Bond during the London Olympics. Millions watched in awe as he soared through the sky, proving that sometimes life really is as cool as the movies. But Mark wasn't the type to rest on his laurels. The man was always chasing the next big adrenaline rush. In 2013, he joined the Eliat 74 event in Chamonix, France, a mecca for wingsuit flyers. The rugged peaks and deep valleys of the French Alps created the perfect playground for those daring enough to push the limits of human flight. Every jump was a chance to etch their names into the sport's history, and Mark was more than ready to leave his mark. On August 14th, the second day of the event, Mark geared up for what was supposed to be a simple warm-up flight. Nothing too crazy, just a 1-minute dive from a helicopter hovering at 10,800 feet. He and fellow wingsuiter Tony Urigallo took their positions, the doors slid open, and that familiar rush of wind hit them. The kind of wind that whispers, "Get ready, this is gonna be epic." With a nod to Tony, Mark leapt into the crisp mountain air, and for those first few seconds, everything was perfect. He soared, the world below blending into a blur of green and gray. At speeds reaching 249 kilometers per hour, the mountains and valleys raced past him. Pure freedom. But in the blink of an eye, everything changed. A slight miscalculation, a small veer off course. And suddenly, Mark found himself on a collision path with a mountain ridge. At those speeds, there was no time for correction. One moment he was flying, the next the flight turned into tragedy. The impact was devastating. A rescue helicopter arrived swiftly, but it was too late. The crash had been so severe that DNA testing was required to confirm his identity. And just like that, the wingsuit community lost one of its brightest stars. News of Mark Sutton's death sent shockwaves through the extreme sports world. The remaining participants at the Eliat 74 event were heartbroken, but they knew the best way to honor him was to keep flying. They dedicated their jumps to his memory, soaring through the skies just as Mark would have wanted. Mark Sutton wasn't just a daredevil, he was a pioneer. He showed the world the breathtaking potential of human flight, and he did it with grace, professionalism, and an unyielding hunger for adventure. His legacy lives on in the sport he loved, in the memories of those who saw his incredible feats, and in the hearts of those who dream of reaching the same dizzying heights.
In early 2005, a U.S. military helicopter carrying 5 Marines crashed in the mountains east of San Diego during a powerful storm, highlighting the risks of flying in extreme weather, even in aircraft built for such conditions. The helicopter, a CH-53E Super Stallion, was the largest and among the most powerful in the U.S. military's fleet, engineered specifically to operate through harsh conditions and nighttime missions. Despite its capabilities, however, no aircraft is immune to nature's extremes. The Super Stallion went down while returning to Marine Corps Air Station Miramar in San Diego from Creech Air Force Base in Nevada. The crash occurred amid torrential rain and heavy snow, blanketing the mountainous terrain in the Cuyamaca Mountains. The last known communication with the helicopter came around 11:30 p.m. during the height of the storm, according to reports from the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. The aircraft's location was initially traced by a signal that had been picked up by a Cal Fire Dispatch Center. The military confirmed that all 5 Marines on board were killed in the crash. Their remains were later recovered from the mountainous site near Pine Valley, about an hour east of San Diego. At the time, Major General Michael J. Borg-Schulte, commanding officer of the 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing, described the loss as deeply painful. "It is with a heavy heart and profound sadness that I share the loss of 5 outstanding Marines from 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing and the Flying Tigers," he said in a statement. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and President George W. Bush also expressed their condolences. The area where the aircraft was found sits at roughly 3,700 feet in elevation and had received up to 8 inches of snow within just a few hours that evening. The nearby Cuyamaca Peak, at over 6,500 feet, adds to the area's challenging terrain, much of which lies within the rocky and heavily forested Cleveland National Forest. Rescue and recovery efforts were hindered by continued snowfall and difficult access to the crash site. The 5 Marines were assigned to Marine Heavy Helicopter Squadron 361, part of Marine Aircraft Group 16 under the 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing at Miramar. As per military protocol, their names were not released publicly until all families had been notified. Captain Stephanie Leguizamon, the wing's spokesperson at the time, acknowledged that the weather had posed serious challenges for search and recovery crews, stating, "I do know that it's cold. I know that's been a contentious issue in accessing the crash site." While the Super Stallion had an established reputation for durability and performance in combat environments, experts emphasize that flying in extreme conditions always carries inherent risk. Timothy Loranger, a former Marine Corps aircraft mechanic turned civilian pilot and aviation attorney, pointed out that although the aircraft was designed for rugged missions, the decision to fly during a severe storm must be carefully scrutinized. Even knowing how capable the Super Stallion is, it's critical for those in command to ask whether the risk is justified, he said. This was a training flight returning to base. Was it necessary to fly in those conditions? Mechanical failure in poor weather would only compound the danger, Loranger added. Although the CH-53E is equipped to handle bad weather, conditions like ice buildup on the rotors can compromise lift and lead to disaster. These and other possibilities, including human error and judgment calls, were all subject to thorough investigation in the months following the crash. The CH-53E Super Stallion, nicknamed the Hurricane Maker, due to the force of its rotor downwash, measures 99 feet long and weighs nearly 35 tons. It can transport up to 55 troops, or approximately 16 tons of cargo, and has a range of about 640 miles. First introduced in the 1980s, it has served in a wide array of military operations, from Lebanon and Somalia to the Gulf War, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Unfortunately, the 2005 crash was not the only fatal incident involving the Super Stallion. Earlier that same year, another Super Stallion went down during a sandstorm in Iraq, killing 31 U.S. service members in what became the deadliest single loss of U.S. personnel during the Iraq War. That crash was ultimately attributed to pilot error. In 2018, the Miramar base suffered another tragedy when 4 Marines were killed after a Super Stallion went down near the California-Mexico border during training. Though pilot error was ruled out in that case, families of the victims later pursued legal action, claiming that a defective aircraft component was to blame. Despite these incidents, more than 130 Super Stallions remain in operation, continuing to play a critical role in military logistics and combat missions. On August 23, 2012, in the quiet expanse of the Ljubljana marshes in Slovenia, a hot air balloon carrying 32 souls, families, tourists, children, was torn from the sky by a sudden storm, killing 6 and injuring 26 more in a horrifying crash that left the nation stunned. It was supposed to be a peaceful morning flight, drifting above the lush green wetlands just south of Ljubljana. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when the balloon, a massive Lindstrand LBL 600C, the largest ever flown in Slovenia, lifted off into what seemed like tranquil skies. The passengers, crammed into a 4-compartment basket stretching over 5 meters long, likely exchanged smiles and snapped photos, unaware of the storm clouds lurking on the horizon. But the weather in the marshes can change fast, and this morning it did. Shortly before 8 a.m., as dark clouds gathered and winds began to twist erratically, the pilot realized what was coming. With little time to react, he began an emergency descent, hoping to get the balloon safely to the ground before the storm hit full force. But just as they neared the fields below, a violent burst of wind shear seized the balloon and hurled it into a stand of trees. The impact was devastating. The balloon burst into flames. Screams pierced the chaos as fire ripped through the envelope in the basket, trapping passengers in a deadly inferno. 4 people died instantly. Their bodies burned beyond recognition. Among them was a family from Ljubljana, a husband, wife, and their 11-year-old daughter, alongside a 56-year-old woman. Survivors, many of them children and elderly tourists, were thrown from the wreckage or pulled from the flames by pure chance. 10 required immediate resuscitation. 2 more would later succumb to their injuries. One woman, after clinging to life for 2 weeks in a Ljubljana hospital, and a 59-year-old man who died days later in Maribor. As news spread, the entire country seemed to stop. That same evening, nearly 400 mourners gathered at St. Michael's Church on the Marshes in Černovac. Candles flickered in the pews. The air hung heavy with grief. Bishop Anton Jamnik led a mass in memory of the dead and wounded, his voice trembling as he addressed a community stunned by loss. In the days that followed, the Sloven Civil Aviation Agency grounded all commercial hot air balloon flights. No one knew for how long. Operators shuttered their businesses, some permanently, families canceled bookings, public trust was shattered. An investigation by the Slovenian Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission would eventually point to a series of failures. The pilot, they said, had used improper landing techniques for the massive LBL-600C balloon, especially dangerous under the conditions. Weather planning was insufficient, they said. The sudden storm should have been anticipated, but it wasn't. The pilot, however, rejected every claim. He pleaded not guilty to causing general danger. A drawn-out legal battle followed, with emotions still raw. When the trial finally reached its conclusion in 2018, a foreign expert's testimony led the court to exonerate him entirely. But for the victims' families, and for the survivors who still carry the scars, some visible, others buried deep, that verdict didn't erase the flames they saw, or the screams they heard, or the lives they lost in the smoke above the marshes. What should have been a tranquil memory, a morning of wonder and awe over the green sprawl of Slovenia, became one of the darkest chapters in the country's aviation history. 6 lives lost, and a haunting reminder that sometimes the sky turns cruel without warning.
The morning air at Tianmen Mountain National Forest Park in Hunan Province, China, buzzed with excitement. Mist wrapped around the towering peaks, blurring the line between earth and sky, setting a mystical stage for the World Wingsuit Championships. Among the fearless competitors was Viktor Kovacs, a legend in wingsuit flying. A 3-time Hungarian national champion with over 700 jumps to his name, Kovacs was admired as a pioneer, a master of blending grace and precision in the art of human flight. August 7th, 2016 started like any other competition day. Tianmen Mountain, with its dramatic cliffs and deep gorges, was a breathtaking yet dangerous playground, the perfect venue for those daring enough to defy gravity. Kovacs had come to China with one goal: to dominate the skies with the agility and control of an eagle. He had prepared meticulously, every jump and maneuver rehearsed down to the last detail. As the mist slowly lifted, revealing the mountain's rugged beauty, the towering cliffs stood tall and challenging, daring competitors to take the leap. Kovacs suited up and made his way to the designated jump point, a dizzying 700-meter high cliff. The clouds still clung to the ground below, making it impossible to see what lay beneath. But for Kovacs, this was just another day at the office. Height, speed, and adrenaline were his natural habitat. The trial flight was meant to be a simple test run, a way to familiarize himself with the terrain before the competition began. As he stood at the edge of the cliff, the world stretched out beneath him, every muscle tensed in anticipation. Then Then without hesitation, he jumped, and for a few glorious moments, he was one with the sky. The rush of air, the blur of the earth below, and the sheer exhilaration of flight consumed him. He moved with the fluidity of a bird, defying gravity and embracing freedom. As Kavats neared the crucial moment to deploy his parachute, something went horribly wrong. The chute failed to open. The exact cause of the malfunction remains a mystery, but the reality was undeniable. He was plummeting toward the earth at terminal velocity, with no way to slow his fall. Spectators watched in horror as the scene unfolded. What had started as a beautiful display of human defiance against nature's limits turned into a tragic reminder of those very limits. Kavats fought to control his descent, his body twisting in a desperate attempt to correct his trajectory, but without his parachute, there was nothing more he could do. The ground rushed toward him with terrifying speed, and the cliffs closed in around him. The impact was catastrophic. The sound of the collision echoed through the park, a grim announcement of the tragedy. Rescuers quickly mobilized, but the steep, unforgiving terrain made recovery incredibly difficult. Over 200 firefighters and police officers worked tirelessly, knowing their mission was now one of recovery, not rescue. When they finally found Kavats, the devastation was heartbreaking. His wingsuit lay torn and bloodied, and the force of the impact had been shattering. The wingsuit flying community was shaken to its core. The loss of Kavats wasn't just the death of a competitor, it was the loss of a brother, a pioneer, and an inspiration. The Red Bull World Wingsuit League honored his memory with moments of silence, giving everyone time to reflect on the fragility of life and the sacrifices made in the pursuit of passion.
On August 19, 2002, one of the deadliest tragedies in Russia's war with Chechnya unfolded in the skies above Grozny. A massive Mi-26 military transport helicopter, the largest in the Russian fleet, was flying over the war-torn capital, packed with more than 120 soldiers. Many of them were officers returning from leave or rotating in to relieve others at the front line. The chopper, already overloaded beyond its safe limit, was heading toward the Kankala military base just outside the city. Then, without warning, disaster struck. At about 5 p.m. Moscow time, a violent explosion rocked one of the helicopter's engines. Smoke and fire began pouring from the aircraft as it started falling rapidly from the sky. The crew tried to issue an emergency landing request, but there was little time. The helicopter, flying at around 600 feet, crashed hard into a field just outside Kankala. What made things worse was where it landed. Unknown to the crew, the crash site was filled with hidden landmines. As the wreckage burned, some of those mines exploded, making rescue efforts incredibly dangerous. Many of the soldiers on board had no chance to escape. The Mi-26's only doors were located underneath the aircraft, which were blocked on impact. The result was catastrophic. 121 of the 127 people on board were killed. This became the deadliest helicopter crash in Russian military history, and one of the most tragic moments of the Second Chechen War. Shortly after the crash, Chechen rebel groups claimed they were responsible, saying they had shot the helicopter down using a shoulder-fired missile. Military investigators didn't immediately confirm this, but suspicions grew. Experts believed a portable missile like the Strela or Igla, often used by Chechen fighters, could have easily hit the low-flying chopper. Meanwhile, Russian officials hesitated to give a clear answer about whether enemy fire or mechanical failure caused the disaster, but there was no denying something had gone terribly wrong. The Mi-26 was only meant to carry about 80 passengers, yet it had been carrying over 120. Overcrowding made it nearly impossible for anyone to escape quickly. Survivors described being packed so tightly that they couldn't move, even as fire and smoke filled the cabin. Some even came under enemy fire once on the ground. The crash caused massive public outrage, and soon, top military officials were forced to take responsibility. 19 officers, including 12 generals, were disciplined for negligence. Some were removed from their posts, and others resigned. The head of Army Aviation, a senior general, stepped down after being blamed for failing to maintain safe operations. Behind the scenes, many in the military were deeply frustrated. Some officers insisted the crash wasn't just about one missile or one decision, it was about years of poor planning, and a military system stretched too thin. Many of Russia's helicopters were aging. Some were over 20 years old and in serious need of repairs. Spare parts were hard to come by, and dozens of helicopters across the country had already been grounded due to safety concerns. In fact, this crash wasn't the first. In the years before, other Russian helicopters had also been brought down in Chechnya, some by technical failure, others by missiles. In one case, a helicopter carrying 2 generals was hit shortly after takeoff from Grozny. In another, officials first claimed a crash was caused by mechanical issues, but later evidence suggested it had actually been attacked. The Mi-26 crash, however, was on a different level. It wasn't just a tragic mistake. It revealed deep cracks in the Russian military's ability to fight this war. The timing couldn't have been worse either. Fighting in Chechnya had started to increase again. Rebel groups were launching surprise attacks in the south and threatening to take the fight back into Grozny. Some believed the rebels were trying to pressure the Russian government to negotiate. Others thought it was an attempt to embarrass Moscow, which had claimed the war was over. Either way, the helicopter crash shattered that illusion. On July 30th, 2016, near Lockhart, Texas, 16 people lost their lives in what would go down as the deadliest hot air balloon disaster in U.S. history. It began as a seemingly peaceful morning, one of those quiet, humid Texas sunrises that balloonists dream of. The skies were overcast, the ground still cool, and the fields around Fentress Air Park sat in a soft fog. At 6:58 a.m., a massive hot air balloon operated by Heart of Texas. Hot air balloon rides lifted off with 15 excited passengers and 1 pilot on board. The plan was a scenic 1-hour flight drifting gently above the countryside. Instead, just 44 minutes later, all 16 people would be dead. As the balloon ascended, it became clear that the weather wasn't cooperating. Thick clouds and fog blanketed the sky, drastically reducing visibility. The balloon drifted into the cloud layer, vanishing from sight even for the ground crew who had been tracking it. Other balloon operators in the area had already canceled their morning flights due to the low visibility, but this pilot decided to go ahead anyway. At 7:42 a.m., the balloon collided with high-voltage power lines, wires carrying enough electricity to instantly ignite the basket. Witnesses reported hearing 2 loud pops like gunshots, followed by the sickening sight of the gondola falling and bursting into flames as it crashed into a field near Lockhart. Emergency services were notified within 2 minutes, but by the time they arrived, the scene was already beyond saving. The basket was reduced to a smoldering ruin, the surrounding grass scorched, and the balloon's envelope had drifted nearly a mile away. All 16 lives were lost in the fire and impact. The passengers were everyday people, mothers, fathers, friends, and couples, celebrating birthdays, anniversaries, or simply chasing the thrill of floating above the earth. Their excitement turned to terror in an instant, but the real horror emerged in the days that followed, as investigators began to piece together the cause. The National Transportation Safety Board's NTSB final report revealed an alarming picture. The pilot, Alfred Skip Nichols, had a deeply troubling record. He had at least 4 prior convictions for driving while intoxicated and had served 2 jail sentences. On the day of the crash, toxicology tests found that Nichols had multiple drugs in his system, including diazepam, used for anxiety, oxycodone, a powerful opioid painkiller, and an extremely high level of diphenhydramine, the active ingredient in Benadryl, which acts as a sedative. The diphenhydramine level alone was high enough to produce effects similar to being legally drunk. Incredibly, despite this history and cocktail of impairing substances, Nichols was allowed to fly paying passengers. Why? Because at the time, balloon pilots were not required to hold a valid medical certificate like airplane or helicopter pilots. That meant there was no mandatory check of Nichols' mental health history, substance use, or criminal background. If the rules had been different, if he had been held to the same standards as other commercial pilots, Nichols would never have been legally allowed near the controls of that balloon. This wasn't a freak accident. It was a tragedy enabled by regulatory blind spots. For years, safety advocates had warned the FAA about the lack of oversight in the ballooning industry, pointing out the risks of allowing commercial balloon pilots to operate without medical certification. But nothing changed until it was too late. In the aftermath of the crash, families mourned publicly and pushed for reform. Heart of Texas hot air balloon rides, whose owner died in the crash, shut down operations. The NTSB issued strong recommendations urging the FAA to finally require medical checks for balloon pilots. But for the loved ones left behind, any change came too late. 16 lives, gone in the span of a few terrible minutes. Victims not only of a deadly collision but of a system that failed to keep them safe. This wasn't just a crash in a quiet Texas field. It was a devastating lesson, one written in fire, silence, and grief, that even a serene sky can become a death trap when the wrong person is given the controls and no one is watching.
Dwayne Weston was the ultimate double act, a guy with one foot in logic and the other in pure adrenaline. By day, he was a buttoned-up computer analyst, mastering the precise, predictable world of software development. But by passion, he was a fearless daredevil who laughed in the face of gravity. Born in Sydney, Australia, Weston balanced discipline and danger like a pro, tackling the binary world with the same precision he brought to soaring through the air like a gymnast. But his true love, base jumping, the wild child sport that only the boldest dared to take on. For those not in the know, base stands for building, antenna, span, and earth. Basically jumping off really high things and hoping your parachute opens in time. In the early 2000s, this sport was the ultimate rebellion against gravity, and Weston was its rock star. He didn't just jump, he flew. He flipped, twisted, and introduced acrobatic moves that took the sport to a whole new level. In 2002, he nailed his legacy by winning the world title with an epic leap from Malaysia's Petronas Twin Towers. Every jump was a calculated dance with death, a perfect balance of courage and control. But even Weston knew that balance was razor thin. That thin line between life and death finally caught up with him on October 5th, 2003, in what would become his final and most infamous act. The scene was set at the inaugural Go Fast Games at the Royal Gorge Bridge in Colorado. This wasn't just any bridge. It hung a terrifying 1,053 feet above the Arkansas River, making it a prime spot for daredevils. And Weston, he was ready to push the limits like never before. This time he wore a wingsuit, a high-flying outfit that basically turns you into a human flying squirrel, letting you glide through the air with incredible speed and control. The plan was ambitious. Weston would soar over the bridge while his buddy Jeb Corliss flew underneath it. Right before the jump, Weston turned to Corliss and said words that would haunt the community forever. Just remember, whatever happens, happens. And then they leaped. At first, everything went as planned. Weston's wingsuit caught the wind and he soared like a superhero. But then, disaster. He miscalculated the wind speed and his distance from the bridge. Hurtling at around 120 miles per hour, Weston slammed into a railing. The impact was brutal, severing one of his legs. Though his parachute deployed, it was far too late. He crashed onto a rock face 300 feet from the bottom of the gorge, where he tragically bled to death. Spectators, excited for a thrill, were instead faced with horror. Some had their cameras rolling, capturing the sickening sound of the impact and the gasps of the crowd. The footage later served as a grim reminder of the sport's dangers. Damage to the bridge took weeks to fix, but the emotional scars lasted much longer. Weston's death sent shockwaves through the base jumping community, yet for those who knew him, his life and death symbolized the delicate balance between passion and peril. He lived on the edge, and though the fall was tragic, his fearless spirit remains unforgettable.
On June 2nd, 1994, a Royal Air Force Chinook helicopter crashed on the rugged slopes of the Mull of Kintyre in Scotland, claiming the lives of all 29 people on board. Among them were 25 of the UK's most senior intelligence and security personnel, representatives from MI5, the Army, and the Royal Ulster Constabulary, RUC. The crash remains one of the worst peacetime tragedies in RAF history and the fourth deadliest in its records. The Chinook had taken off from RAF Aldergrove in Northern Ireland, bound for a high-level security conference in Inverness. The timing was critical, just 2 months before the IRA announced a ceasefire. The flight, however, never reached its destination. Flying in heavy fog, the aircraft crashed into a hillside, instantly killing everyone aboard. The disaster sent shockwaves through the intelligence community and the government. Air Chief Marshal Sir William Ratton described it as the largest peacetime tragedy the RAF had suffered. The fact that so many top-level operatives had been placed on the same helicopter raised eyebrows. Why were so many critical personnel, key figures in the fight against terrorism in Northern Ireland, on a single flight? This question, among others, fueled public outcry and speculation. The crash's cause was not immediately clear, and over the years it became a magnet for conspiracy theories. Some suggested a secret hypersonic U.S. military aircraft had caused wake turbulence that brought the Chinook down. Others speculated that the crash had been an assassination linked to the fragile peace negotiations underway in Northern Ireland. The Chinook's safety record had been considered strong up until that point. Northern Ireland Secretary Sir Patrick Mayhew stated that there were no plans to ground the rest of the fleet, despite the severity of the incident. But as investigations began, controversy quickly followed. An RAF Board of Inquiry concluded that the accident had been caused by gross negligence on the part of the two pilots, Flight Lieutenants Jonathan Tapper and Richard Cook. This finding enraged their families, colleagues, and supporters, who launched a lengthy campaign to clear their names. Critics of the report, including politicians and aviation experts, argued that the evidence did not support such a harsh judgment, especially given the difficult flying conditions and the complex nature of the Chinook's systems. For over 2 decades, the fight to exonerate the pilots continued. The Ministry of Defense faced criticism not only for blaming the pilots, but also for a lack of transparency around documents and decision-making tied to the case. Some feared that key information might be destroyed or hidden, prompting calls from victims' families, the Church of Scotland, and even MPs to preserve and release all related records. Ultimately, the campaign succeeded. After years of pressure, the verdict of gross negligence was overturned, and the pilots were officially exonerated. Their families, while relieved, were left with lingering grief over the time it took to clear their loved ones' names. The crash was a severe blow to the UK government's counter-terrorism operations at a crucial moment in the Northern Ireland peace process. Losing 25 senior intelligence and security officials in a single event created what one account called a temporary confounding of the British government's efforts to suppress IRA activities. It was a tragic loss, not just in terms of human lives, but also institutional knowledge and momentum at a sensitive political juncture. Today, a memorial stands on the mole of Kintyre, marking the site of the crash. It serves as a solemn reminder of those who died that day, those who served quietly and strategically, far from the public eye, in the effort to bring peace to a deeply divided region. On August 13, 1989, near the rugged outskirts of Alice Springs in Australia's Northern Territory, 13 lives were violently snatched from the sky in a collision that turned a peaceful sunrise into one of the darkest mornings in ballooning history. It was just after dawn, 6:38 a.m., when 2 hot air balloons, part of a group drifting serenely over the vast, rust-colored outback, collided mid-air. Witnesses described one balloon rapidly ascending from below, rising too fast, too close, and then the unimaginable happened. Its envelope, bright red and black, wrapped itself around the basket of the balloon above. In seconds, a massive tear opened up, the size of a bedsheet. The wounded balloon hung in the air for just a moment, hovering, silent, before it folded in on itself and dropped like a stone. Passengers in nearby balloons could only watch in horror as the stricken craft spiraled downward from 2,000 feet. The descent lasted just 51 seconds, but to those watching, it must have felt like eternity. One tourist later said, "It fell to the ground like a streamer." Another balloon pilot frantically radioed emergency services, but by the time help arrived, the damage had already been done. The basket slammed into open scrubland between 2 small trees, about 16 kilometers from Alice Springs Airport. 10 of the victims were still linked arm in arm inside the basket. The other 3, thrown violently from the gondola, were found scattered in the sand nearby. All 13 on board perished, including the pilot. Among them were 10 Australians, along with a Danish man and an Italian passenger who lived in Monaco. Every one of them had stepped into the balloon expecting a breathtaking view of the outback. None would return. But the crash wasn't just tragic, it was preventable. The investigation revealed a damning series of failures. The upper balloon, which initiated the fatal contact, was flying without its mandatory instrument package. Its pilot, Michael Sandby, refused to cooperate with investigators. Worse, though both balloons had working radios tuned to the same channel, neither pilot communicated with the other. A devastating silence in the skies. The report also found that the pilot of the lower balloon, the one that crashed, had failed to properly assess the position of the other balloon before climbing. It was a fatal misjudgment in a sky that, while wide open, had become far too crowded in that single moment. Justice, however, was partial at best. In 1992, Sandby was found guilty, not of manslaughter, but of committing a dangerous act, a unique legal charge in the Northern Territory. He was sentenced to just 2 years in prison, with only 8 months required before parole. 13 people died, yet the full weight of accountability never seemed to fall. In the aftermath, regulations were tightened, surveillance improved, and ballooning in Australia changed forever. But none of it could bring back those who had perished, their final moments spent plummeting toward the unforgiving earth in a scene that haunted witnesses and investigators alike. What began as a quiet morning adventure over the outback became a deadly ballet in the sky, a reminder that even in the most serene moments, one small mistake can unleash chaos, and that in the wide open air there's no room for silence.
On September 29, 2016, Eric Dos Santos, a veteran wingsuit pilot with nerves of steel, geared up for what was supposed to be just another day at the office. Except his office happened to be the sky over the stunning French Alps. In the opening moments of his adventure, everything looked totally chill. Eric, with his helmet cam ready, flashed a casual au revoir before takeoff, completely unaware that this flight was about to turn into an absolute nightmare. As he soared over the snow-capped peaks and craggy cliffs, the scenery was straight up breathtaking. Picture lush green forests, dramatic drops, and Eric's shadow racing below him like a tiny fearless ghost. It was the perfect blend of thrill and serenity, man and nature vibing in perfect harmony. But just 51 seconds into this epic journey, things took a terrifying turn. Out of nowhere, Eric started losing altitude, and fast. In the blink of an eye, what should have been an exhilarating ride almost turned into his last. His camera captured every heart-stopping second as he skimmed treetops at a jaw-dropping 90 miles per hour. And then, bam! Disaster struck. He clipped a tree at full speed and the screen went black. Just like that, the flight was over. Miraculously, Eric survived, but not without some serious damage. His left side took the brunt of the impact, leaving him with fractures in his shoulder blade, collarbone, and 3 ribs. As if that wasn't enough, he also suffered a bruised neck, head injuries, a cut liver, and a collection of nasty gashes on his head. His recovery even required time in a hyperbaric chamber to treat his head trauma. Honestly, the fact that he lived through a high-speed wingsuit crash without deploying his parachute is nothing short of insane. In fact, Eric is only the second person ever to survive a crash like this. Now, if you're wondering what kind of daredevil sport this is, let's break it down. Wingsuit flying is the closest humans get to being actual birds, or more accurately, bats. The special suit has nylon membranes stretching between the arms, legs, and body, transforming the wearer into a human glider. By using tiny, precise shifts in their arms and legs, pilots can steer themselves through the air with grace and speed. This sport is especially beloved by base jumpers, who skip the whole airplane thing and launch themselves off cliffs, tall platforms, or other ridiculously high spots. Once airborne, it's all about control. And trust me, it's not as easy as it looks. Even seasoned pros struggle with the delicate art of steering. One wrong move or miscalculation can lead to disaster, as Eric's story clearly shows. While Eric's survival is nothing short of miraculous, not every wingsuit flight ends so fortunately. His brush with death serves as a reminder of the extreme risks involved in chasing the dream of human flight.
November 6, 1986 began like any other day for the 47 men on board a Chinook helicopter traveling from Shell Expro's Brentfield to Shetland. The British International Helicopters aircraft departed with 3 crew members and 44 passengers, heading towards Sumburgh Airport. The weather was calm, and the journey was expected to be routine. As the helicopter approached the runway, the pilot radioed a standard 2 minutes to landing message. It was flying at 500 feet and preparing for descent. But without warning, the aircraft vanished from radar. Within seconds, it had plunged into the North Sea. There was no time for a distress signal. The Chinook broke apart on impact and sank rapidly. Emergency responders rushed to the crash site, but the scale of destruction was devastating. Wreckage floated across the sea, and the mission quickly turned from rescue to recovery. Only 2 men survived the crash: pilot Pushp Vade and passenger Eric Morans. The remaining 45 perished, making it the worst offshore helicopter disaster in Scottish history. The cause of the accident was a transmission failure that led to the twin rotor blades colliding mid-air. The gearbox failed, causing the rotors to crash into each other. With the rear rotor severed, the helicopter lost control and plummeted into the sea, falling approximately 50 meters. Vade and Morans were miraculously pulled from the water by a Coast Guard helicopter piloted by Captain Gordon Mitchell. One clung to a life raft. The other held onto a piece of debris. Both were flown to Lerwick's Gilbert Bain Hospital for treatment. The Chinook had been stationed at Sumburgh since November 3rd to support shuttle flights between oil platforms in the East Shetland Basin. That morning's flight was slightly delayed due to an oil leak in the gearbox, but after repairs, it departed at 8:58 a.m. Over the next few hours, the helicopter visited multiple platforms, exchanging passengers and freight, before leaving Brent Platform C at 10:22 a.m., with 44 passengers aboard. Everything proceeded normally until the final minutes of the return trip. Air traffic control cleared the aircraft to land on runway 24, but shortly afterward, the helicopter was gone. The official investigation confirmed that a critical failure in the transmission system caused the mid-air collision of the rotors. The mechanical breakdown happened with no warning, and the crash occurred too quickly for any effective response. The incident prompted serious questions about the maintenance and reliability of offshore aircraft. The tragedy was a deep blow to the North Sea oil industry, which had already experienced several air accidents. Many of the victims were from northeast Scotland and included professionals from various fields: engineers, technicians, and even a well-known local rugby captain, Doug Lowson, 30, who had led the Gordonians rugby team. 30 years after the disaster, a memorial service was held at St. Nicholas Kirk in Aberdeen. The service honored the 45 men who died, with family members, industry officials, and community members in attendance. Their names were read aloud, followed by a minute of silence and a piper's lament. Reverend Gordon Craig, chaplain to the oil and gas industry, led the service, emphasizing the importance of keeping the victims' memories alive. Despite further helicopter incidents in the years since, the 1986 Chinook crash stands out for its scale and suddenness. On what had been a beautiful, clear day in Shetland, 45 lives were lost in an instant, leaving a legacy of grief, remembrance, and a call for safer skies. On January 7, 2012, in the peaceful skies above Carterton, New Zealand, 11 lives were extinguished in a fiery nightmare when a scenic hot air balloon struck high-voltage power lines, burst into flames, and came crashing to Earth, marking the deadliest ballooning disaster in the nation's history. The day began as so many others had in this quiet rural town in the Wairarapa region. The weather was clear, the air calm. At 6:38 a.m., the balloon, named Mr. Big, lifted gently from the grassy fields with 10 excited passengers and a seasoned pilot at the helm. They had signed up for a 45-minute panoramic flight, hoping to greet the new day with a bird's-eye view of vineyards, farmlands, and rolling hills. The pilot, Lance Hopping, was one of the country's most experienced balloonists. With over 10,000 hours of flying time, he was a respected figure in the ballooning community. even serving as safety officer for the region's biggest balloon festival. No one doubted his skill. No one saw it coming. As the balloon traced a graceful figure 8 over Carterton, the chase crew waited below, ready to assist with landing. But around 7:20 a.m., the balloon began drifting toward danger, heading east toward a set of 33,000-volt power lines that stretched across the land like an invisible snare. Witnesses watched in disbelief as the balloon edged closer to the wires. Then, a shout broke through the quiet morning. "Duck down!" It was the pilot, but it was already too late. The basket snagged on the lines. Sparks exploded in the sky. For 20 agonizing seconds, the balloon scraped along the conductor, powerless to break free. Then came the arc, a searing burst of electricity that caused one of the gas cylinders to rupture. Flames erupted instantly. In a split second, 2 passengers made the impossible choice to jump, plunging 20 meters to their deaths below. Above them, the balloon ignited, flames clawing their way up the envelope. As the fire intensified, the balloon began to rise again. One of the power lines snapped, and Mr. Big, now engulfed, shot skyward. It reached 150 meters before the fabric gave way entirely. The balloon disintegrated midair. The wreckage fell like a meteor into a paddock just south of Somerset Road, 600 meters from the highway. Chase crews and families watched in horror as the sky, once filled with promise, turned into a funeral shroud. Emergency responders arrived within 7 minutes, but nothing could be done. All 11 people on board were gone, lost in a firestorm that lasted only moments but scarred a nation forever. What made it worse was what came after. Toxicology tests later revealed that the pilot had THC, cannabis, in his system at the time of the crash. The Transport Accident Investigation Commission determined that his judgment had been impaired, likely contributing to his fatal decision to try and climb over the wires rather than descend rapidly to safety. It wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a preventable one. This wasn't the first time the TAIC had investigated a transportation disaster involving drugs or alcohol. In fact, it was the 6th such case in 10 years. But this one, involving a man so trusted and experienced, shook the public faith and demanded reform. The Commission issued urgent calls for stricter drug and alcohol policies across New Zealand's aviation, marine, and rail industries. It took 2 full days for all the bodies to be recovered and transported to Wellington Hospital for formal identification. The victims had names, stories, families. There were couples, cousins, a boyfriend and girlfriend. Some were local to Masterton and Wellington, others from nearby towns. All of them had boarded that balloon expecting a quiet, breathtaking journey through the sky. None of them knew it would be their last. The balloon Mr. Big, with its bright red and yellow colors, had flown for over a decade. But in those final moments, it became the symbol of a disaster that exposed not only the fragility of life, but the cost of complacency and safety oversight. 11 lives ended in a blaze of fire and falling canvas, leaving behind only silence and the echoes of a tragedy that should never have happened.
March 29th, 2014 began like any other adventure for Dan Vicari, Ludovic Worth, and Brian Drake, 3 of the world's most skilled and daring wingsuit flyers. These guys weren't just thrill seekers, they were masters of a sport that combines the heart-pounding rush of freefall with the beauty of controlled flight. It takes years of dedication, fearlessness, and skill to reach their level, and they'd earned their place among the best. That morning, they gathered in the Luxor Valley in Switzerland, a picture-perfect destination for extreme sports enthusiasts. With its towering ridges and steep descents, the valley was a natural magnet for wingsuit flyers chasing the ultimate adrenaline high. This was supposed to be another exhilarating day, a chance to sharpen their skills and revel in the stunning backdrop of the Swiss Alps. As their helicopter climbed higher into the clear blue sky, its rotor slicing through the crisp morning air, the 3 men looked out at the vast stretch of snow-capped peaks glistening in the sunlight. But these mountains weren't obstacles. They were a playground. For Vicari, Worth, and Drake, the sky was their home, and the mountains were where they pushed the limits of human flight. At the jump point, they carried out their final checks. Their wingsuits, sleek, custom designed, and perfectly tuned, were ready. They'd meticulously planned their flight path, aiming for a steep route over a ridge that would give them the speed and altitude needed for a flawless glide. It was a challenging route, but one they had flown before. They knew the risks, but they also knew the reward. That feeling of absolute freedom when everything went right. The moment arrived. The helicopter doors swung open, and one by one, they leapt into the void. The rush of air hit them instantly, but it was a familiar embrace. In seconds, their wingsuits transformed their freefall into a graceful, controlled glide. Below them, the valley stretched out like a living map, the rugged terrain and winding slopes unfolding in breathtaking detail. For a while, everything was perfect. They gained speed and altitude, moving with the ease and precision that only comes from years of practice. But then, something went wrong. Instead of staying on their planned route, they veered off course. The steep descent they'd aimed for was now behind them, and ahead lay flat terrain, a wingsuit flyer's worst-case scenario. Without updrafts or natural features to help them stay airborne, their margin for error shrank dangerously. In wingsuit flying, altitude is everything. Lose too much of it, and recovery becomes nearly impossible. Realizing their mistake, the trio tried to adjust, turning left toward a more favorable slope that could provide the lift they desperately needed. But the correction came too late. The ridge loomed ahead, its jagged rocks and sheer cliffs a brutal reminder of the mountain's unforgiving nature. Vicari and Worth, unable to gain the altitude needed to clear the ridge, crashed into the ground with devastating force. The impact was fatal. In an instant, two of the sport's brightest stars were gone, their incredible lives cut short on the cold, unforgiving earth. Drake, flying close behind, managed to avoid an immediate collision, but was forced into an emergency landing. Though he survived the crash, his injuries were severe. Despite the best efforts of rescuers and medical teams, he passed away 4 days later. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the wingsuit flying community and beyond. These weren't just any athletes, they were legends, admired and respected worldwide. Their deaths served as a stark reminder of the sport's inherent dangers, where the ultimate thrill often comes at the ultimate cost. In the days that followed, an investigation was launched to determine the exact cause of the accident. While some details remained unclear, it became evident that a miscalculated flight path and the unexpected terrain played a significant role. The deviation from their planned route left them with too little altitude and even fewer options for recovery. The incident also sparked a broader conversation about safety in extreme sports. Wingsuit flying had always been risky, but the loss of such experienced flyers raised serious questions about how those risks could be better managed. As tributes poured in from friends, family, and fellow athletes, one thing became clear. Vicari, Worth, and Drake were more than daredevils. They were pioneers, fearless adventurers who pushed the boundaries of human flight. They lived for the sky, and though their journey ended too soon, their legacy continues to inspire those brave enough to chase the wind.
On the evening of February 4th, 1997, something haunting unfolded in the skies above northern Israel. Something that would leave behind not only wreckage, but also one of the most tragic and mysterious events in the nation's military history. Two Sikorsky CH-53 Yasser helicopters, among the largest and most powerful in the Israel Air Force fleet, took off from an airbase in northern Israel. Their mission was routine, or so it seemed. On board were 73 soldiers and crew members bound for military posts deep in southern Lebanon, the well-known Beaufort Castle and the Pumpkin Outpost, located within the Israeli-declared security zone. These troops, drawn from the Golani and Nahal infantry brigades, the Armored Corps, and other key units, had done this kind of mission many times before. They were young, many of them still in their late teens or early 20s, but they were trained, disciplined, and ready. Some were new recruits, others seasoned fighters. All carried the weight of Israel's ongoing security operations in southern Lebanon, an area plagued by tension, ambushes, and Hezbollah attacks. Despite the danger of the destination, no one expected the threat to come from the skies themselves. The two helicopters, flying in formation on a dark and cloudy night, approached the Galilee area near the border. Then, without warning, without radio distress calls, something went wrong. In a flash of noise and fire, the two helicopters collided mid-air. One of them plummeted to the ground near the moshav of Shahar Yeshuv, a peaceful community known more for its rustic charm than tragedy. The second helicopter crashed into a field close to Kibbutz Dafna. Flames lit up the sky. The explosion was so massive that people from nearby towns reported hearing the impact and seeing fire in the distance. Rescue teams rushed to the scenes, but there was nothing to save. All 73 souls on board both helicopters were killed instantly. The shock that followed was immense. Israel had never experienced a helicopter crash of this scale. It became known simply as the helicopter disaster, and overnight, it plunged the entire country into mourning. The funerals stretched on for days. Families across Israel buried their sons, brothers, and husbands, young lives full of promise, now suddenly gone. Schools, bases, and neighborhoods held memorials. Radios played somber music, and still, the same question echoed everywhere. How could this happen? A government commission was quickly established to investigate. Teams of aviation experts, military analysts, and senior commanders examined every angle. They reviewed flight logs, interviewed air traffic controllers, replayed cockpit communications, and studied wreckage. Pilots were questioned. Weather patterns were analyzed. Nothing was left untouched. And yet, despite all this, a clear answer never came. The final report offered no single cause. It suggested possible contributing factors, perhaps a breakdown in communication, a lapse in protocol, or a misjudgment of distance in low visibility. But it didn't name one definitive reason. The mystery remained unsolved. For a military known for its precision and order, this uncertainty became almost unbearable. As years passed, the pain of that night never fully faded. Near Kibbutz Dafna, where one of the helicopters went down, a memorial was erected. A quiet, solemn space featuring a still pool surrounded by 73 boulders. Each one bears the name of a fallen soldier. Visitors come there not just to remember, but to feel the weight of something larger than themselves. A sense of collective grief, of loss too vast to fully grasp. And still, the skies remained restless. In the years that followed, other accidents would shake the Israeli military. Helicopter malfunctions, crashes, and training incidents took more lives, including those of elite pilots and EGOS unit officers. Each time, the military launched new investigations, striving to uncover root causes and ensure the safety of future operations. The promise was always the same: to search without bias, to learn from mistakes, and to care for those left behind. Despite these efforts, the mystery of the 1997 disaster loomed like a shadow over every investigation that followed. Every time a rotor spins or a pilot takes off into the night, the echoes of that crash linger in the background. On February 26, 2013, in the ancient city of Luxor, Egypt, a peaceful sunrise hot air balloon ride turned into the deadliest ballooning disaster in history for 19 people. It's the kind of once-in-a-lifetime experience people dream of, but for 21 passengers that morning, the dream turned into an absolute nightmare. The balloon lifted off just after 7 a.m. It belonged to Sky Cruise, one of the many companies offering tourists an unforgettable view from above. What the passengers didn't know was that this very same balloon had been in a previous accident less than 2 years earlier, and that Egypt's balloon safety regulations had slipped badly in the years following political unrest. Moments into the descent, things started to go horribly wrong. A gas leak, silent and unseen, ignited a fire near the base of the basket. Witnesses said the fire erupted just a few meters off the ground as the balloon was attempting to land. As the flames surged upward, the pilot and one passenger managed to jump out and survive, but the balloon, caught by a gust of wind, rose rapidly, trapping everyone else inside. Panic erupted in the basket. Smoke, flames, and screaming. 7 people jumped from the balloon midair in a desperate attempt to escape the fire. The balloon climbed higher, up to 1,000 feet. Then, in a horrifying instant, a massive explosion rocked the sky. The blast was so loud it could be heard from miles away. The remaining passengers plummeted to the earth, crashing into a sugarcane field below. By the time emergency services arrived, 15 minutes later, the scene was pure chaos. Bodies were scattered across the field. The air still smelled like burnt fuel and scorched earth. Only 2 people had survived, the pilot, who was badly burned, and 1 British tourist. 19 others died, including travelers from the UK, France, Belgium, Hungary, Japan, and 9 tourists from Hong Kong. Among the victims were couples, friends, and adventurers who had simply signed up for a beautiful morning ride. People like Joe Bampton and his girlfriend Susanna Getve, who were just 40 and 34 years old. Yvonne Rennie from Scotland died that day, while her husband Michael survived with injuries, left to carry the weight of the tragedy alone. This wasn't just the worst ballooning accident in modern history. It was the deadliest of its kind since the infamous Hindenburg disaster of 1937. What makes it even more haunting is that safety warnings had come before. Crashes in 2007, 2008, and 2009 had raised red flags. In 2009, 16 people were injured in another crash in Luxor. There had been promises of reform, improved pilot training, better equipment, designated launch zones. But in the aftermath of political upheaval, oversight slipped away. And so, what should have been a magical flight over ancient wonders turned into one of the darkest moments in hot air ballooning history. It's a chilling reminder that even the most serene experiences can turn deadly in an instant, and that behind every tourist attraction is a hidden risk we rarely think about until it's too late.